Good job.
Okay, good afternoon, dear all. Let's welcome Martin for his sixth lecture.
Thank you very much. So welcome back to 10 lectures on diachronic construction grammar. This lecture will continue with the general topic of constructional networks and the nature of the links between constructions in speakers' knowledge of language. So in the last two lectures, I have talked about connectivity change. I've talked about the growth and the development of constructional networks, how they expand, how they contract, how they shrink. I've talked about different corpus-based methods that allow us to make observations about these processes, and also what general conclusions we can draw from those observations with regard to proposals in grammaticalization theory and other frameworks. So there's one kind of relation between constructions that I haven't been talking about very much so far, and that relation would be if two constructions are alternatives to each other. Yeah, they have similar functions and they can be seen to be in mutual competition. So in this lecture, which is called Competition in Constructional Change, I want to expand a little on the topic of competition in constructional change. So two or more constructions have emerged, let's say, as nodes in the constructional network. They have undergone constructionalization in Traugott and Trousdale's terms. They're connected with each other because they share part of their functional profile, perhaps even part of their form. And so they would constitute what's often called an alternation. Yeah, an alternation. That's a term that actually goes back to generative syntax and the idea of transformations. So the implication at the time was that two members of an alternation, two member constructions, would be seen as underlyingly the same structure. Yeah. So for instance, the active voice and the passive voice, that's maybe the classic case. They would be seen as members of an alternation, like active voice, John drove the car, passive voice, the car was driven by John. And so the passive would be a transformed variant, so to speak, of the active. All right, so this particular idea of transformation, as you may know, has fallen into disgrace pretty much. And I've mentioned Goldberg's surface generalizations hypothesis, which goes in the exact opposite direction, which states that surface form are what's important, not generalizations across alternating variants. But it's safe to say that despite all this, it's fair to say that alternations have made something of a surprising comeback in recent years. So there's something intellectually somehow very attractive and interesting about alternations, which are two ways of saying the same thing. And you might wonder, well, why do luxuries afford this kind of luxury to have two things for the same purpose? So that is something that people like to think about. And I have to say, I had to come around to this. So I wasn't drawn to this naturally, but I have been convinced that there is something to it, that there is something to be analyzed. I've been strongly influenced, for example, by the work of Benedikt Smrečani, who I mentioned earlier today. So he and his work, that has really opened my eyes towards the intricacies of alternations, especially as we find them in English. So we find them presumably in all kinds of languages, but there has been a tremendous amount of work in English. In fact, okay, so I'm going off script here, but I need to tell this little joke that I stole from Jacques Dubois. So Jacques Dubois once opened a plenary talk that he gave with the sentence, "The study of language encompasses the fields of phonology, morphology, and the dative alternation." And well, that's of course, that's a quip, but there is some truth to it. The dative alternation is one of those pairs of constructions that have been studied to death, you might say, right? So there's not only the dative alternation, there's the two genitives, the S genitive and the off genitive. There's the two comparatives, prouder, morphological variant, more proud, the periphrastic variant, and so on and so forth. So if you're on the lookout, you can actually find quite a few of these. And the members of alternations are fruitfully analyzed in terms of competition between constructional variants, and that's what I'll be talking about in this lecture. So the way in which I want to talk about it relates to basic idea number 1 that I presented in the very first lecture. So the idea that all of linguistic knowledge, according to construction grammar, is a network of form-meaning pairs and nothing else in addition. So when we think of competition in the network of constructions, we're thinking about two nodes that are connected in the sense that, let's say, the speaker thinks of a particular meaning that they want to express, and then that meaning is connected to two different forms. So which form the speaker chooses, given everything I've said so far about how this network is organized, that would depend on the strength of the symbolic link between the meaning and one of the respective forms, right? So we can imagine that the stronger connection, however we might define that, the stronger connection wins and the weaker connection loses, and that there is perhaps even some kind of feedback mechanism, some kind of change that happens when a construction is selected from the alternation. So the winning connection might be rewarded, might be made even stronger, and the losing connection could be punished so that it's even weaker, and the next time the speaker wants to express that idea, any bias that was there in the first place is even stronger the second time around. Right, so this is a question that has been thought about a lot, and has generated quite a bit of discussion. When one construction changes, what happens to other constructions that are connected to it? So the common idea is that one construction's success leads more or less directly to the demise of another competing construction. And this is very much the heritage of structuralist approaches. Generative approaches have taken it wholesale and continued with that idea. And the underlying thought, you might say, is that language change is systemic. We see a lot of evidence for that in sound change for example. There are other areas of language where we might say, that that's how it works. There is a system where everything holds everything else in place. Right. And also construction grammar has adopted this kind of idea that constructions can be in competition, they can work against each other if their meanings, if their functions are sufficiently similar. And, there's a recent paper by Hendrik de Smet and colleagues from the University of Leuven that I'd like to draw your attention to. So it's been published in Cognitive Linguistics. And in that paper, de Smet and colleagues comment on that particular idea. They say the relation between functionally similar forms is often described in terms of competition. And this leads to the expectation that over time, only one form can survive. That would be substitution. Or each form must find its unique niche in functional space, and that is differentiation. Okay? This is kind of the, broad consensus. It's an implicit consensus often, so it's rare that I find it spelled out in this way that de Smet and colleagues do it. De Smet and colleagues ultimately question this idea a little bit. They propose a more nuanced perspective, and I will come back to this tomorrow. So for now, let me just say that I have gone on the record with a somewhat non-canonical position with regard to this here, and I've already shared that with you. So in my constructional change book, I have advanced the idea that grammatical change is not a zero-sum game. Slogan that I thought very, I thought that would catch on. It didn't. But anyway, so I had my doubts whether when one construction adopts new functions, it would necessarily drive out another construction that would be situated in that area of functional space. So when we look at languages, partial functional overlap is common, not rare. Yeah, so inversely, we could say that we have things like polysemy. Yeah? Polysemy is rampant. And if we had these nice structuralist systems with one-to-one form-meaning correspondences where any expansion of meaning would lead to the retreat of another form, then that really shouldn't be there, I thought. Yeah? And another qualitative piece of evidence, perhaps, is that grammatical constructions emerge in domains, or tend to emerge in domains that are already relatively well represented by other constructions. Let me give you an example. So English has 9 core modal auxiliaries, and that is a perfectly fine and working grammatical paradigm. And yet there are new modals that are coming into the grammar, and things like got to or have to, yeah, which do approximately the same job as forms that are already there. Yeah? So we already have must. Why do we need got to? Why do we need have to? I don't think the competition model can explain that. Yeah? You need additional assumptions that people have proposed and that can very well explain why people start saying things like I have to go. But it doesn't follow. It's not predicted by the competition model. Anyway, Bill Croft has made a point that I see as compatible with my views here. He has argued that functional pressure, so the kind of pressure that would bring constructions into competition, that's not what actually drives competition between constructions. So functions are crucial, he says, when speakers innovate. Yeah, speakers are keen to express a certain idea. They're looking for new ways of expressing a given idea, and so they come up with a new way of saying whatever it is they want to say. So this is what Croft calls altered replication of linguistic forms. So, for example, they say I have to instead of I must. Yeah, they say I'm going to instead of I will. And the examples are legion. Now, the whole competition business happens in what Croft calls propagation. So, an innovation is already there. Propagation describes how it spreads through a community of speakers. And this propagation, Croft argues, is not functionally motivated. It doesn't have anything to do with how well a form is functionally adapted, how useful its meaning is. Rather, Croft argues it is socially motivated. He says the basic mechanism for propagation is the speaker identifying with a social group. It's kind of strange when many people nod, so you seem to connect to this more easily than I did when I wrestled with the idea. But what I take away from the insight is that when we study constructional competition, I think it's very relevant, and many people have said this long before me, to include social factors into our analysis. So in what follows, I'd like to present to you a study of constructional competition, again from my 2013 book, in which I try to do that. Yeah? So besides all these theoretical considerations, studying competition also has some implications for methodology. So I'll be turning to a corpus-based method that moves a little bit away from constructional analysis and the other types of analysis that I've been discussing up to this point. All right, so how do we study competition? I have a few basic assumptions or starting points here. So I think if we want to study how competing forms develop over time, it would be good to have analytical methods that study processes of language change more comprehensively than just in terms of text frequency. Most of what I've shown you so far relies crucially on text frequency. But that's not all there is. Yeah? The frequency of an item may stay constant, and still there are interesting things happening to it. Second, our methods should allow us to identify the driving factors, the explanatory factors that drove a linguistic change, and when and why they did so. Yeah. Also, the method should be able to somehow identify or distinguish between factors that are more important and less important, have less or more functional power, so to speak. And lastly, the analysis that we do should facilitate theoretical generalizations again, rather than just presenting us with single case studies or enlighten us about single facts. Right, so in this lecture, I'd like to present a case study of allomorphic change. So we're moving from the verbal grammar that we looked at yesterday to the nominal grammar that we looked at this morning to allomorphy into a smaller level of linguistic organization. And I want to focus on a development that happened to the English possessive determiners. So those are the words my and your in present-day English. Yeah. Now, in the period of English that I'm looking at, the early modern English period, there were several variants of these possessive determiners. The first singular form was mine. Okay. In German, there's a word that sounds exactly like that, and correspondingly in the second person there was thine. Yeah, and over time, thine, which it's voiced. All right, and these are obsolete. Yeah, so it's if you don't recognize them, that's because you were born too late. And these dropped their nasal final consonants. Yeah, so they turned from mine and thine into my and thy. Yeah, so thy corresponds to what we now express as your. So there was this further shift after the period that I'm investigating here. So I want to exemplify how diachronic corpus studies can usefully adapt methodologies that have been developed elsewhere, namely in Lebovian American variationist sociolinguistics, which has a great deal to teach us in this context. And I want to explain how change in allomorphy relates to the issue of competition in constructional change. So let me start by saying a few things about allomorphy. So there are a few examples of allomorphy that students of English have to learn in their first introduction to English linguistics. And that would be that, well, the phenomenon concerns phonemic variation between two, sometimes even more, realization of the same morpheme. So one of the examples that is always used is the English plural allomorphy. So we have ships with a voiceless s, we have harbors with a voiced z, and we have cruises with also a voiced z that has a schwa before it. Another type of allomorphy you see in the two indefinite determiners of English. So there's an apple, there's a banana. Oh, by the way, again I'm going off script, but there's a fantastic article in the satirical journal of linguistics, The Speculative Grammarian, about the allomorphy of the English indefinite article, and I would strongly suggest that you look up that article. It's hilarious. Okay, so what conditions this variation? What causes people to choose one or the other? Well, the variation between an apple and a banana, you know very well, that is conditioned by the quality, the sound quality of the next element, yeah, the initial element of the noun. So typically phonological factors are at work. Typically allomorphy is discussed in the context of grammatical morphemes, even though there's stem allomorphy where lexical elements also show this behavior. And typically speakers don't vary in their choices. Yeah. So there's no dialect where the distribution of and an is somehow different than in others, although there are these exceptional cases, like you find people naming their books an historical account of something. Yeah, so these things are there, and of course there are alternations like dreamed and dreamt. Yeah, so when there's two different a regular and an irregular variant of a past tense form, or cannot and can't. Tomato, tomato, yeah, so there are in fact regional variations, but that's what it is, yeah? All right, so what I'll be looking at in this talk is a case where there used to be flexibility, where there were a number of different factors governing variation, and where eventually the flexibility disappeared. Yeah? So today, speakers do not say mine old friend any longer. They say my old friend. Yeah? But there was a time when for speakers it was possible to be a little bit progressive and say my old friend, and when you felt a little bit more conservative, you would say mine old friend. Yeah? And the same, of course, applies to the second person form, thine and thy. Now, why now would it be advantageous to study allomorphic variation from a constructional perspective? So a critic might object that formal variation that is not tied to any tangible meaning variation is in fact irrelevant to construction grammar. Yeah? So we're concerned with form-meaning pairings, and when we have two forms that map onto exactly the same meaning, well, that is something that, let's say, not many constructional studies focus on. Mine and my, they definitely focus on the same meaning. And furthermore, if not only the semantics, but also the syntactic behavior of the allomorphs is nearly identical, then there would be little left to analyze from a constructional perspective. But contrary to that position, I would like to argue that the issue of allomorphy relates to the question of what a construction actually is. Yeah? But let's move ahead and get to the actual analysis now. Right, so the starting point of any analysis is, of course, the data, which in my case are often collections of historical texts. You see a couple of manuscripts on this slide that are the actual manuscripts that are contained in the corpus that I used for this study. I used the pen-parsed corpora for Middle English and Early Modern English. And the phenomenon of possessive determiners, the words mine and my and thine and thy, in front of a nominal, as in these examples here, so with mine, own eyes, or the days of my life, they are found in these manuscripts. So they're all typed up and digitized and searchable by corpus linguistic software, but this is just to show you where the data come from. Right, so in the pen corpora, there is considerable variation, inter-speaker variation, so different speakers do different things, but also intra-speaker variation, so that the same writer uses sometimes this form and sometimes another. Okay, so many writers use both mine and my, that is, form with a final nasal and forms without it. Yeah? So sometimes they show a certain preference. So this writer here has a preference for the conservative variant. And this second writer here, well, you see the distribution is somewhat 50-50. Yeah? So more progressive. And what I'm interested in here is, well, is there an explanation for this variation? Yeah? In fact, there's not only one explanation, of course, there are many interlocking explanations. Here are some of the explanatory factors that I take into account. So, trivially, of course, there's time. Yeah? Later texts are more likely to contain the modern endless variant. But there's the phonological context, too. So, if the word directly following the possessive determiner begins in a consonant, as in my life. Yeah? So life starts with an L, that's a consonant, so that would favor the endless variant. Stress patterns play a role. So when I say, well, that was not my idea, that was his idea, that favors the endless variant. That's a little tricky to extract from writing, of course. At least this kind of contrastive stress, but there are well, conventionalized stress patterns of words that help us a little bit here. Gender. Yeah, so here we're moving into language external factors. So women are known to be progressive across many linguistic changes. And this is no different here. So when we look systematically at the gender of the authors, then women can be seen to favor the progressive endless variant. One thing that has been proposed is that formality plays a role, which seems reasonable enough. Yeah. So formal genres show a preference, show a bias towards the N variant, the old one. And then there are frequent collocations, like mine own son. Yeah, that my own son in modern English. So, what's it about frequent collocations? Well, we know from other studies that chunks, frequent collocations, are conservative. They are produced very often together, and so within a strong collocation, within a chunk, an old variant has a stronger chance of survival. Yeah. And you see this in some idioms and in some expressions that preserve sort of old syntax or old morphology. So Shakespeare could say things like "I know not," instead of "I don't know," and we still have that kind of thing in idioms like "I kid you not." Yeah, I kid you not. There we have the ancient pattern of negation. You can't do that with other verbs or with expressions that are not idiomatic in any way. Anyway, so these are some of the explanatory factors that have been proposed. And in the following, I want to address these questions here. So, which of these factors have a reliable effect on the choice between mine or my? Did the effects stay constant over time, or did they change? And then, did mine and thine change in the same way at the same time? Or would we be forced to say that they actually followed different trajectories? Yeah, that's kind of important to find out, because we want to know, do speakers have a single generalization for all of these forms, or are there separate generalizations for mine and another one for thine? Right, so I'll start with the first question here. Which of these factors have a reliable effect? And for that, I got some help from variationist sociolinguistic approaches, which have long been concerned with exactly this problem. So there has been a focus on alternative expressions, like, for instance, the quotative be-like that I've mentioned already a couple of times in this lecture series. So when you quote someone else's speech, do you say, he was like, that is great, or do you say, he said, that is great? Your social allegiances might explain to some extent whether you should choose one or the other. Yeah. And the lesson that many sociolinguistic studies have taught us, that speakers' choices tend to be governed by probabilistic explanatory factors. So in the case of, let's say, the choice between the two genitives, the S genitive and the off genitive, maybe the most important determining factors are not social, but rather language internal, like there are semantic factors, the animacy of reference, there are syntactic considerations, so constituent length plays a role. Speakers are generally more likely to place long constituents towards the end of an utterance, at least in languages such as English. And there are differences, of course, between different text types, and there's a host of other extra linguistic factors like age, gender, the speech situation, and so on and so forth. Right, so in a large database of examples, we find an example such as the days of my life. Yeah? What can we do with that? Well, we can actually determine the relative frequencies of my and of mine in different contexts. And then we ask, well, how likely is the endless variant in this case, given that we have a text that was written in a particular year, in this case 1564. The next word starts with a consonant, yeah, life. The writer is male, yeah. the text is from an informal genre. We have someone writing to a family member, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, given all of these factors and all these variables and their levels, how likely is this outcome of the progressive endless variant? This is very much a standard procedure established from sociolinguistic Warburg studies, they were called at the time, and now there's a sizable literature that applies logistic regression methods to morphosyntactic variation. Right, turning now to the second question, did their effects stay constant over time or did they change? Well, we know that the variation between mine and my was transient. Now, today, mine only survives in deliberate anachronisms. That means factors that once triggered the use of mine, today they're no longer effective. You no longer know about this form. So the system has turned from a network of probabilistic, mutually competing factors into a fixed system where everything is discrete. So the analysis of changing effects is something that's a little more tricky to analyze, and yet it very much describes a well-attested scenario of language change. For example, historical studies show changing impacts of explanatory factors. Again, I'm coming to Benedikt Smercani's work here. So he has shown that the S genitive, my brother's car, that used to be very strongly restricted to animate possessors, but that restriction has loosened. So today we can say the company's car or the university's policy. So the effect strength of animacy has changed over time. Yeah? For earlier speakers, animacy was a strongly determining factor, and for present-day speaker, that effect has become weaker. Then we have apparent time studies showing different impacts for different age groups. Again, let me take the example of be-like, which is preferred by female speakers, but most strongly by adolescent female speakers. So there's an effect strength of gender, that interacts with age. You want to use this form, but specifically if you're young and female. Right. So we can establish that the process of language change involve change in the ecology of conditioning factors. Some factors become more important, others may fade away and cease to be important, and entire domains of variation may eventually dry out and become fixed and fossilized. And I would like to argue that diachronic corpus linguistics can offer a contribution to the study of such phenomena. But before we get to the actual analysis, I still need to briefly talk about the third question, namely, did mine and thine change in the same way at the same time? So, why is this question important? If the two forms change in different ways, that would be evidence for the idea that mine and thine each formed a generalization of their own. And hence the two would be different, if of course related constructions. So what the question boils down to is whether we are dealing with one constructional change or in fact with two constructional changes that happen simultaneously. Right, so with all of this in mind, how did mine and thine change to my and thy? Here you see a graph with what sociolinguists call an S-curve. You see the relative frequencies of the new endless variant pooled for all the corpus files of the same year. So the higher a point is on the graph, the closer the data is to present-day usage. You see that the scale on the y-axis goes from 0 to 1. 0 means all writers use the old variant. 1 means all writers use the new variant exclusively. And it's plain to see here that, well, there's much more data for the final 2 centuries than the previous ones. So we know more about the final bit of the development than we know about the earlier stages. But all in all, so all things considered, the S pattern is fairly clear. So this is what an S-curve looks like. Of course, we know more about the data than just relative frequencies. So all examples that I found in the data, all in all, some 18,800 examples. So that's a lot of data. People use mine and thine quite a lot. Yeah? These data points come from 440 different corpus files, and every every corpus file then has the potential to show some intra-speaker variation. Right. So all the examples that I collected, I annotated this time for 8 variables. Let me anticipate the question, why these variables and not others? So in this case, I took these variables from the literature. There were people who had studied this kind of variation and who had come up with pretty much exactly this list, save for 2 variables that I'll get to. They are at the very end here. But let me go through this one by one. Yeah. So the first variable is the phonological environment. Does the following word after my or thy or mine or thine, does that begin with a consonant? Does it begin with a vowel, or does it begin with an H? Yeah. So why, you might ask, should we make the H a third category? Well, that's because there's variation in the way it's pronounced. Sometimes it's more vocalic, sometimes it's more glottal, and so we can assume that this will be a kind of messy profile that we see with H's. I already mentioned stress, so I annotated a second variable if the following syllable was stressed or not. Yeah? And there I just took the stress pattern of the word. English is what's called a stress-timed language. So words have conventional stress associated with them. It's university, not university. Yeah? If you want to sing a funny song and you include university, then people will find that funny. Yeah, that they will accept that. But it's recognized as a deviation from a conventional norm. Right. I of course annotated for grammatical person. Do we have a first person form like my? Do we have a second person like thy? I distinguished 2 levels of formality. So some genres I said were formal, texts from the Bible, law texts. I also, informal texts were personal letters, I mentioned that, or there are comedy texts in there. Then the gender of the writer, are we looking at a text written by a male speaker, a female speaker, or is the gender of the writer unknown? Yeah? In historical documents, that's quite often the case. Another complicating factor that might be on your minds is that many texts were actually written by scribes. So, so speakers of the nobility, they could just dictate their letters to scribes who would note them down. We know from other research that these scribes didn't impose too much of their own preferences on those documents, but they were fairly faithful to whatever it was that the original writer of the letter thought and said. Okay, now on to the variables that I included, but that are sort of new to this particular phenomenon. So these variables I took from other variationist studies. So in a way that they had been used before, just not in this context. So one variable here is priming. If we look at the previous context in the text, yeah, let's say the previous 50 words, do we have an instance of mine or thine or my or thy in that context? If that is so, then there are reasons to think that the writer will be influenced, yeah, that they will still have some activation going on that would make it more likely that also this time around they choose the same variant. Yeah? So I distinguish between things being primed or things not being primed. Then there's one variable that I came up with myself, namely the relative frequency of the following element. So there are some expressions that just happen very often in the data that I analyzed. So an expression such as mine own, yeah, my own, that occurs very frequently. And there's abundant evidence that increased frequency of a linguistic item leads to conservative behavior. So since mine own is produced and processed as a chunk, as a single unit, speakers are reluctant to switch to my own, even if they do so with other less frequent collocates. All right, let's now look at all of these variables and see how their impact may have changed over time. So in this graph, you see again the S-curve that you saw earlier with the raw data, but here we see it split up for the three different levels of the variable of the phonological environment. Yeah, so three S-curves, one for possessive determiners that appear before a consonant, that appear before an H, and that appear before a vowel. Again, the higher the data point, the higher the proportion of my instead of mine. And what you can see in this graph is that the three curves, they start at different points in time and get to the final destination earlier than others. Yeah? So what you can see is the effect of the phonological environment has a temporal contour. The switch from mine to my starts in pre-consonantal environments like my life. Possessive determiners before H, as in my head, and before vowels, my own, they remain on a very low level until very late. Yeah? So you see this curve here starts out pretty much already in the very beginning, and the others, they stay low for quite some while. So the difference is largest here in period 5, close to the end, and the others catch up after that. Right, so that's the phonological environment. Let's move on to stress. In this graph we see that the factor of stress on the following syllable has a clear effect. So the N-less variant is more frequent in pre-stress environment, that is, with things like my father rather than with my idea. But also here, the effect is not equally strong across all periods. So in periods 1, 4, and 7, there's practically no difference. Yeah, so again, the effect is not completely uniform. Right, what about grammatical person? So with grammatical person, we hardly see a difference. And that is quite noteworthy. Yeah? Perhaps we might be a little speculative here. When we discard period 3, yeah, where there's a little difference, then we could say that on the whole, first-person forms are a little bit in the lead. Yeah, first-person forms are the white circles here. So my is leading the way for thy, but yet it looks as though the developments from mine to my and from thine to thy proceeded very much in lockstep. Yeah? Presumably because they're phonologically very similar. So speakers form a generalization across mine and thine, so that in contexts appropriate for my, they were also deemed to be suitable for thy if we're talking about a second person. I will come back to this later in the talk. Here's formality. So formality had been argued to be a conditioning factor for the older N variant, and the Penn corpora actually don't confirm this idea. You see that the two curves, they are not distinguishable from one another. So very likely there is no effect here, even not a transient one. Right, what about gender? So here you see a problem, namely that with historical documents, often the gender cannot be known with certainty. Yeah? So pretty much the only reliable data we have is for the last 3 corpus periods, and reassuringly, in those 3 periods, females, those are the black dots, they are highest up, so they are in the lead. Yeah? And males are the most conservative. Males are the empty circles here, and we have the unknown gender writers in the middle of them. Yeah. Okay. So even though the data is patchy, I'm the first to admit that, I would go out on a limb and say that that probably is a small effect of gender. Right. Priming. Human language users are creatures of habit, and if they use a form once, they're likely to use it again. Yeah? And this graph shows you that the N-less variant is indeed very frequent when the N variant has appeared before. Again, the only exception to this tendency is period 3. You see here, the lines cross and recross again. So that might be an oddity in the data. Period 3 has been, you will see that period 3 is actually something of an outlier here in this data. All right. So far we've covered phonology, stress, person, formality, gender, and priming. We're still missing frequency, and for that I would like to show you a graph that may look a little strange at first. It's actually quite straightforward, so let me explain. What you see in this graph are again the 7 corpus periods, and for each period you see uses of the n variant in white and uses of the n-less variant in gray. There are squiggly and wavy patterns to the left and right in each section of the plot here, and those are frequency distributions of the right side collocates. And the interesting bits are these little bumps here that you see high up on the graph. Those are items, collocates, that appear in the respective periods with mine and my and so on and so forth with relatively high frequency. So my hypothesis was that mine would show a preference for high frequency items because high frequency chunks would be stored as single units, and so they would be conservative. Yeah? So I expected mine to pair a lot with very frequent items. Yeah? And in a pairing like mine own, that should clearly show up in the data. Now what you see is that there are these little bumps. Yeah? They're not only in the n variant. Yeah? I mean, these are the ones that I predicted. But later on we find them also on the other side. Yeah? So there are frequent items with my. That's the opposite of what I predicted. That sometimes happens. Let me show you the actual words that correspond to the bumps. Yeah? So in the early periods here, we have something like mine heart or mine God. Yeah? Those are the frequent collocations. In period 3, we have mine love, or translates into my dear. So that is a term of address, and that's why it's very frequent here. And in later periods, we have mine own in period 6 and 7. Conversely, if we look at the frequent collocations with my, so my lord, in official correspondence, people were writing to their superiors, and my lord, that was simply a frequent combination that was written in the modern way. Right. So the n-less variant has also a good number of chunks, and most prominently so in the last period. So here we would have expected greater numbers of low frequency items. Again, frequency has some kind of effect, but the effect is inconsistent. My initial hypothesis was too naive. So let me summarize what I've said so far. For time, the n-less variant is more frequent in later periods. With regard to the following segment, the n-less variant originates in pre-consonantal environments and then spreads to pre-vowel and pre-H. With regard to stress, the n-less old variant is more frequent before stressed syllables. With regard to person, the n-less variant is a tiny smidgen more frequent in the first person. With regard to gender, the n-less variant is a little more popular with females, so females are progressive. I didn't find any consistent effect of formality, and with priming there's a small effect. And in collocate frequency, there's really no consistent effect. There's something going on, but it's not clear what. So knowing all of this is a good start, but the impact of different variables across time is only one part of the story. The piece that is still missing concerns the third question: did mine and thine change in the same way? We've seen that they change roughly at the same time, but how similar or how different are they with regard to their conditioning variables? So if there are differences, this would suggest that there are two changes taking place and not just one. So let's take a look. So on the following slides you will see a number of so-called mosaic arrangements. One for first-person forms on the left, and one for second-person forms on the right. Yeah, so the n-less variant forms, they're shown in the lower half. Yeah, these here. The n-variant forms, they're shown at the top. And overall, you see that the modern n-less forms are overall more frequent in the corpus than the old n-variant forms. And you also see that in the second-person mosaic, there are relatively more n-variant forms. So there's a difference between mine and thine. Yeah, overall, the percentage of thine, relatively speaking, is greater. So for demonstration purposes here, the areas of first and second person forms are shown as equally large. In fact, there are way more first person forms than second person forms. So I just want you to be aware of that. Now the crucial information in this graph is whether there are differences in the way in which the four areas here are internally partitioned. So what you see is that my and thy mostly occur before words that start in a consonant. Yeah? And this is simply because adjectives and nouns, the elements that follow possessive determiners, they have a tendency to start in a consonant. And with mine and thine, consonants are underrepresented, while vowels and H's are overrepresented. So the question now is, are vowels and H's equally overrepresented across first and second forms, or is there a difference? Yeah, in other words, is it surprising that this little piece of the graph has the size that it has, and is that different from the size that this piece of the graph has? All right, when we look at this part of the graph here, first-person forms appear to have a slightly bigger preference for prevocalic environments. Yeah, if you compare this breadth here against this, then this one is bigger, but the effect is not very pronounced. So likely there is no difference between mine and thine with regard to the first variable of the phonological environment. What about stress? Yeah. So here we have the same kind of mosaic design, only that this time what we have in terms of the partitioning here is unstressed versus stressed. So you see that in most cases the following syllable is actually stressed. Both mine and thine show a slightly larger proportion of unstressed following syllables. If we look at these two here, with mine, this preference might be just a tiny bit stronger, but again, there's not a strong effect. Things look different when we come to formality. Yeah? So the mosaic for formality, what's striking here is that the N variant shows a greater ratio of examples from formal genres. Yeah? Do you see that? So with mine, formal examples are here, and for thine, there are way more formal genres. Yeah? So there's a straightforward explanation for this effect. Thine hardly ever occurs in informal texts because the alternative form your develops in this period from which these data are taken. Yeah? So the rise of your definitely interferes with the usage of thine and thy, but it does not interfere with mine and my. So here we have suggestive evidence to the effect that first and second person forms might in fact be developing in different ways. Right, so according to the variable of formality, mine and thine do likely not develop in identical ways. I'd like to come to gender and show you another mosaic plot, and also here there's an interesting, somewhat minor difference. So note that female users are relatively less likely to use thine in their writings. You see that females have this very thin strip of thine. They use mine a little more in comparison. Now, it is of course true that most female writers that are in the data come from later periods of the corpus, so this could be an artifact, but that kind of artifact can be addressed in the statistical analysis that I'm about to talk about. So lastly, it remains to be discussed whether the effect of priming is different across first and second person forms, and this is the last graph of this kind. So here it's evident that the N variant benefits from priming. Yeah? So, you see that the areas for N primed are wider than the strips that we see for the N-less variant. Yeah? So that's the difference. This is relatively narrow, this is relatively wide, this is relatively narrow compared to this. So primed examples account for a bigger share of the overall number of examples than in the N-less examples. And the lesson from that is clear, actually. You don't need priming to get my, but priming may help you to get mine. Okay? When there's a form that is on its way out, yeah, you're generally less likely to use it, except when you've recently heard it. Yeah? So that's then an opportunity to remember it and come back to using that old variant. All right. Is this effect different across the two persons? Probably not. Yeah. So it looks kind of the same. But again, this is something for the regression analysis to figure out. So if we now come back to the three questions one more time, we can try to formulate a few conjectures. Which of the factors have a reliable effect? We're fairly certain that time, the following segment, stress, person, gender, priming, and the collocates that we see would have an effect. Did their effects stay constant over time, or did they change? We hypothesized there would be changes in the following segment. Yeah, so that effect looked like it might be time sensitive. Also the effect of stress and the effect of collocate frequency, which was non-uniform across time. There we would expect this kind of interaction effect. And did mine and thine change in the same way at the same time? Well, there are some minor differences in formality, in gender, and in priming. And these hypotheses can be tested if we fit what's called a logistic regression model to the data that tests for the respective main effects and interactions. Okay, I need to say a little bit about the statistical modeling here. So which factors make a difference at what time? That can be addressed with what's known as binary logistic regression. So that's a technique that can be used to investigate the variables that influence a binary choice, either in an experiment or in natural language used from corpora. So in language, there are quite often two ways of saying the same thing. Let me take an example that I haven't used so far. So this is a phonological alternation. There is a variable called yod dropping. Yeah? So people can say, she is such a good student with a y glide in it, or she is such a good student without that glide. There's also, of course, the alternation between be going to and will. I don't know what I am going to do. I don't know what I will do. And there is the infamous dative alternation. John gave Mary the book. John gave the book to Mary. And so what do you analyze in such a design? So the basic question would be, in all of these cases, can you explain why a speaker sometimes does this and sometimes something else? What are the variables that can explain this behavior? The explanatory variables can be linguistic, I've said that, or they can be language external. So for the example, she is such a good student, or she is such a good student, your region of residence, that plays a role. Your age might play a role. Your gender or your level of education could come in. So all of these are language external factors. For something like the dative alternation, John gave Mary the book, John gave the book to Mary, there is a host of factors that have been studied that contribute to the alternation. So for instance, pronominality, whether the recipient is expressed with a pronoun. John gave her the book, or a full noun phrase. John gave the woman the book. That plays a role. So if the recipient is pronominal, then there's a preference for the ditransitive as opposed to the prepositional dative. There are even some what we could call hard constraints. So the animacy of the recipient plays a role. I can say John threw his keys to the floor. I cannot say John threw the floor his keys. Yeah, that would imply that somehow the floor is animate and is waiting to catch the keys that John throws at him. So inanimate recipients bias speakers very strongly and consistently towards the prepositional dative. And finally, also the definiteness of the theme. So whether I have an indefinite noun phrase like John gave Mary a letter, or a definite noun phrase John gave Mary the letter, that makes a difference. Not that big of a difference, but it does make a difference in that indefinite noun phrases, they like to occur at the end. So that's why we get a preference for the ditransitive again. Right. So with regard to the dative alternation, then we have these language internal factors of animacy, pronominality, and indefiniteness. All of those are language internal concerning morphology, semantics, and pragmatics, respectively. Right. So all of this just to give you a small backdrop for the study design. Like these alternations, the case between mine and my has one linguistic variable, which we call the dependent variable, which is binary, categorical, that is a choice between A and B. And A and B are called the levels of the dependent variable. Then there are several explanatory factors, language internal and language external. They can be categorical, such as accusative versus dative, or pronominal versus nominal. They can be continuous, as in length in words or word frequency. And all of these variables can be integrated into the analysis. You employ a binary logistic regression generally in order to obtain answers to questions like which explanatory factors have an influence on the dependent variable, how strong are the respective variables in their influence, and how well do the variables explain the variation that we observe. What kind of data do you put into this analysis? In corpus-based research, you would have to retrieve all occurrences of language use in a given corpus where speakers actually have the choice between A and B. So for the case of the student alternation, you would have to find all words where an U can be preceded by a glide. Yeah. With the give, marry, the book alternation, you would have to find all instances of the ditransitive and all instances of the prepositional dative. Coming back to my and mine, here we would collect all instances in which writers use a possessive determiner, and they have the choice between either the N variant or the modern N-less variant. Right. What does the regression do with that data? It calculates a formula that allows you to predict for new examples, for unseen examples, maybe from a different corpus, how likely it will be that speakers choose the N-less variant rather than the N variant. So if in a large database of examples we find an example such as the days of my life, how likely is the N-less variant given its date of production, given its phonological environment, given the gender of the writer, given the formality or informality of the genre, and so on and so forth. All right. There is one little complication that I unfortunately need to discuss, and that is that sometimes variables may interact. Yeah? So several explanatory factors can sort of conspire with each other. And that would yield an effect that is different from what we would call a simple main effect. So a main effect obtains when an explanatory factor always has the same effect on the choice between A and B. Yeah? An interaction effect, by contrast, is an explanatory factor that has an effect on the choice between A and B, but this effect depends on another variable. So you could paraphrase the idea of an interaction effect as variable XYZ has an effect, but only if something else is the case in another variable. So let me give you an example. Let's say we're interested in speakers' use of polite or direct pronouns in a corpus. The dependent variable would be the use of a polite pronoun or not. And let's say that the explanatory factors that we take into account are age, gender, and formality. So a main effect of a pronoun of gender, there's a typo here, sorry. So a main effect of gender would be that female speakers have a bias towards more polite pronouns. Yeah. And an interaction effect would be that, gender and formality somehow conspire. Yeah? So formality biases, so here I put old and young speakers. So if formality interacts with age, that means formality biases old speakers towards polite pronouns, but young speakers are not affected. Yeah? I try to visualize that here. So here we're dealing with what I had in mind, namely age and gender. A main effect looks like this. You compare male and female speakers across two different age groups, and it turns out that male speakers pattern together. The old males speak like the young males, and the old females speak just like the young females. Yeah? So this would be a main effect of gender. An interaction effect would be if, let's say, old female speakers have this preference for polite pronouns, yeah, but young female speakers don't, and they pattern exactly like the old and young male speakers. Yeah? Don't look so sad. It will become relatively obvious as we go along here. All right. So back to mine and my. When we look at this graph here, right stress has an effect, but sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's not. So we should test whether there is an interaction between time and stress. Here I'm coming back to one of the mosaic graphs with gender here. So gender has an effect to so that females use more endless forms. They are more progressive. But we might ask whether this effect is equally strong for first person and second person forms. So we could test whether there's an interaction between gender and person. Right. So which factors make a difference at what time? I fitted a regression model in which I tested for main effects of all of the explanatory factors that I mentioned here. And I tested for a selected range of interaction effect. So time and following segment, there we can be pretty sure that there's an interaction because we said that the effect of the phonological environment was time sensitive. Time and stress, also there we saw that the effect of stress is not uniform across time. The same goes for time and colloquy frequency. I also tested for interaction effects between person and formality, person and priming, and person and gender. And since this is what's called a mixed effects regression model, I included the authors and the respective corpus files as what is called a random factor. Right. What came out? There are main effects for time, for the following segment, for stress, for priming, for gender, and for colloquy frequency, meaning that only two variables that were included originally turned out to be non-significant, and those are person. Yeah? So ultimately, no real difference in no evidence for a separate generalization for second and first person possessive determiners, and no effect of formality. So what you do in this kind of situation is that you rerun the analysis, excluding those variables that don't have a significant effect. Yeah. So I did that again, obtaining significant effects for the variables that mattered already the first time around. And I looked at the interaction effects that the model returned as significant. So there's an interaction between time and stress, so that the effect of stress is significant, but it becomes weaker over time. There's an interaction of time and colloquet frequency. So the effect of colloquet frequency is significant, but unstable. So this is confirmed by the analysis. We saw that earlier. The interaction between time and the following segment. Yeah? A following consonant always increases the likelihood of the endless variant, but the effect is strongest in the early periods. Yeah? So, I don't want to bore you with too many technical details. There are good technical indicators of model fit that tell us that this is actually a model that tells us something useful about the data. Yeah, that it's a useful summary of the data. I'm really sorry that I am bombarding you with strange-looking graphs in this lecture. Yeah, this is somehow an unfortunate coincidence, but I'd like to give you another quick look under the hood of the regression model. And what you see in this graph shows you how well or how poorly the model discriminates between examples of the n variant and the n-less variant. So even though this looks very complex at first, I promise that in 2 or 3 minutes or so, you will look at this and go, oh yes, sure. Yeah. So what you can see here are examples of the n variant. They're shown as gray little specks. And there are examples of the n-less variant, the new variant, and they are shown as black little degree signs. Yeah. So everything that's gray, that's the n variant, that's the old stuff, and everything that's black, that is the new variant. Yeah. And so you see that there's a y-axis, and this y-axis tells us how likely the model. So the model tells us if it places an example up high, that means that the model is convinced that we're looking at a modern n-less variant. And if the model places a dot down here near 0, that means that the model says, I think this is an n variant. So ideally, we would have all the gray spots down here in this half, yeah, and we would have all the black spots up there. Yeah? Ideally, we would want a very crisp and clear distribution that this half down here is all gray, that half up there is all black. And what you see that this is not 100% the case. So, to rephrase this, in this version of the graph, I have circled, or I have put all of those guesses that the model makes into boxes that are correct guesses. Yeah? So if we have dots in here, in this box, then that means the model has made the right assessment. Yeah? And let me walk over here. So you see that, for instance, here in the last period, the model guesses for the overwhelming majority of n-less forms correctly that they are n-less, and there are only a few down here that are misclassifications. And that is actually the reason why I want to show you this graph. We want to figure out where and why the model fails. Okay? Machines are imperfect, and we want to learn a little bit about why and when they fail. And here are the misclassifications. Yeah? So in the first period, there are a few modern forms. Yeah? But the model misclassifies them and says, I'm very sure that these are n forms. Yeah? Fail. In the second period, again, the same thing. But notice that there are also a couple of n forms which the model classifies mistakenly as n-less. Yeah? That is what's up here. Going further, we see that, oh, well, that's an oopsie here that the model committed. Yeah, there are lots of forms that are misclassified. Conversely, up here, yeah, that's also not good. But you see that globally, yeah, the model guesses the right thing most of the time. So let's look at some of these misclassifications in more detail. I promise I will be done very soon. So, for example, what is going on here in the fourth period? Yeah, there is a set of examples classified as endless, but they do have an n. Yeah? So it turns out that in this period the model overestimates the discriminative power of the following segment. So if a form is followed by a word beginning in a consonant, such as my brother or my friend, then the form is given a high likelihood estimate for the modern variant. So this can be considered an honest mistake that the model makes. Yeah? So the following segment used to be a very powerful discriminant variable in the earlier variable, but in the fourth variable that importance is decreasing. The factor is becoming less predictive, less strong. So if we're looking at these examples here in the sixth period, there are a number of examples where the model is not quite sure whether they are really to be classified as endless. So those are actually correct classifications, but the model is less sure of that than with these data points that are up here. Yeah? So these are examples before vowels and H's, with the model kinds of suspects, well, if something is an N form, then it would appear before vowels or H's. Yeah? All right, then these examples here, again in the fourth period, they are given, they're not misclassifications, but they are, again, there the model is less sure than it is up here. And they are not followed by a stressed syllable. So there are combinations like my confession, yeah, my con and then fashion. That's what happens in those examples here. So long story short, I'm the first to admit the graph is terrible, yeah, but it allows you to look under the hood of this kind of statistical analysis, which can be a black box in many cases. And that's really not what statistics should be. Yeah, statistics should be a tool to guide you towards the examples that are relevant and that you want to look at more closely. And ultimately, this is what I wanted to discuss here. Right. I'll, in the interest of time, I'll skip the short part about cross-validation here. The main point of that is that I try to see how good this analysis is by giving it unseen data from a different corpus, and the model actually succeeds in classifying that data rather well. Summing up, I think that there are issues of theoretical interest in construction grammar that can be analyzed in a very satisfying way with methodologies that we borrow from frameworks like variationist sociolinguistics. And in this particular case, I was after the question of whether two forms develop in identical or different ways. And I hope to have shown that, well, there are very small differences between mine and thine that would sort of speak for the idea of two changes going on at the same time. But really, there is a lot more evidence that would suggest that this is really just one constructional change. Right. So the change from mine to my is a case of constructional competition that has gone to completion, and the propagation of the new variant has led to a complete substitution of the old variant. And this kind of propagation can be shown to relate to different factors, both language internal and language external. So we have a very good idea of what caused competition at various points in time. And the quantitative techniques that I've applied here can help us uncover how propagation actually proceeds. So different factors influence competition at different times with different strengths. And that's a conclusion that I would like to leave you with today. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Now is the question time.
Hi, Professor Martin. This time my question is very short, I promise. You talked about the priming effect, but I also remember this. You mentioned also in the book the qualitative effect. Yes. Yeah, so how to distinguish the two effects?
Yeah. When do you get passive attention? When you get avoidance? Yeah. So, well, I guess the answer to that I would be kindness be